Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session, Transportation Modeling and Programming in the Chicago Region. Our speakers today are Craig Heather, Mary Weber, Sarah Buchhorn, Jose Rodriguez, and Greta Ritzenthaler from CMAP. You guys can get started whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you. Well, as you said, we're going to talk about transportation modeling and programming transportation funds today. We'll have a panel of staff from CMAP. So we'd like to talk first about programming transportation funds, and then we'll spend a majority of the time talking about travel demand modeling. We'll go over some of the data requirements of the models, the main steps of the models, how we validate the models, and then how the models are used. So I'd like to start just by telling you a little bit about our agency. CMAP is a regional planning agency for Northeastern Illinois. We cover 7 counties, including the one shown on the screen: Cook, DuPage, Kane, Kendall, Lake, McHenry, and Will. And that covers 284 municipalities. Our agency was created in 2005 to better integrate land use and transportation planning in the region. And it was created by merging 2 agencies that had existed for a number of decades. First being the Chicago Area Transportation Study, which did transportation planning, and secondly, the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission, which did land use planning. Our agency is also a federally designated metropolitan planning organization, which means there are some other federal requirements that we have. One of them being completing a long-range transportation plan that has to look at least 20 years into the future. Currently, our region's implementing Onto 2050 plan, which not only covers transportation, but also covers housing, economic development, open space, and other quality of life issues. We also have to maintain a transportation improvement program, which lists federally funded projects and regionally significant non-federally funded transportation projects that are programmed to be implemented over the next 5 years. We also have to document all the transportation planning activities performed using federal funds in a unified planning work program. And since our region has more than 200,000 people, we have to maintain a congestion management process, which is a systematic method for providing information about system performance and potential alternatives for dealing with congestion. And finally, our region doesn't meet federal standards for air quality for ozone or particulate matter, so we have to actually do air quality conformity analysis to show that we meet vehicle emissions budgets. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mary to talk about programming transportation funds.
Thank you, Craig. So I'm going to provide an overview of how CMAP assists with the programming of transportation funds for the region. And if you could go back to the previous slide, please. Give a brief intro here. So programming in Northeastern Illinois is a little different than in other regions. While we maintain the repository for transportation projects, which we call the ETIP, we are not the programmers for many of the projects in the ETIP. Instead, we work with our 30 partner agencies, many of which are the programmers and implementers of these projects. We work with the programmers to be stewards of the funds that are allocated to this region and to present these projects to the public. While we strive to work with our partners to provide a clear vision of the transportation needs and solutions for the region. Next slide, please. So CMAP does not program all the projects for the region. While we do have some funds that we are directly responsible for, which we'll discuss later, our programming partners vet and program their projects independently. However, we do provide guidance and assistance to ensure that decisions are based on state and federal regulations. Additionally, through the region's ETIP, we also keep the official record of federal transportation funding for the region. The ETIP is a tool for programmers to submit new projects as well as project changes. It's also available to the public to view and search for projects. While our programming partners are responsible for the data entered into the ETIP, the CMAP team works with programmers to ensure fiscal constraint, accuracy of description, and attempts to help implementers move through state and federal processes in order to move projects towards completion. Next slide. CMAP is responsible for programming CMAQ, TAP-L, and STP Shared Funds. To allocate these funds, CMAP solicits applications from eligible project sponsors. Eligible sponsors include municipalities, counties and townships, highway agencies such as IDOT and the Illinois Tollway, and transit agencies, including the CTA, Metra, and PACE. Other units of government, such as park or forest preserve districts, may also sponsor projects. Projects may be on roads, transit, or bicycle and pedestrian facilities, and we can fund engineering, right-of-way acquisition, and construction, but typically cannot fund transit operations. All of these basic eligibilities are determined by federal law. Locally, we can narrow the focus of projects funded through federal programs, and we do so by developing project selection and programming methodologies through our project selection committees. Next slide. CMAP has been programming the CMAQ program the longest. We receive these funds to program only because we are a non-attainment area. Therefore, the funds must be spent only on projects that can reduce transportation-related emissions. There is about 115 million available to program each year, and we hold a call for projects every 2 years. Eligible project types include improving access to transit, improving transit service and equipment, traffic flow and intersection improvements, constructing bicycle facilities that serve as an alternative to driving, and projects that can provide a direct reduction of emissions through a variety of measures such as idle reduction, alternative fuels, retrofitting engines with catalysts or filters, repowering vehicles with cleaner engines, or replacing vehicles with alternative fuel vehicles. Projects are evaluated based on criteria that vary by project type. Some factors used are safety, reliability, connectivity, health benefits, and inclusive growth. While staff analyzes applications and makes funding recommendations, projects are selected and programmed by the CMAQ Project Selection Committee. Next slide. The next source is TAP. TAP funds are programmed by both CMAP and IDOT. IDOT calls their program the Illinois Transportation Enhancement Program, or ITEP. We call ours TAP or TAP-L. About 9 million is available annually, and although federal regulations include several eligible project types, our region decided several years ago to focus these funds on projects that can complete the Regional Greenways and Trails Plan. These projects are evaluated on their potential to complete that plan, the market for the facility, safety and attractiveness, inclusive growth, and project readiness. These funds follow the same call for project schedule as CMAQ and are also programmed by the CMAQ PSC. Both CMAQ and TAP allow up to 80% federal funding, with the remaining 20% covered by the local agency sponsoring the project. Next slide. The third source that CMAP programs directly is the STBG program, which we call STP. The region receives an allotment of approximately 160 million per year for a broad range of project types, again, at an 80% federal, 20% local funding share. Although CMAP and our predecessor CATS have been responsible for programming these funds for decades, how we do that has changed in recent years. Next slide. Historically, we've relied on the Sub-Regional Council of Mayors and City of Chicago to make all of the STP project selection decisions. Funding available to the region has been allocated to the councils and the city, and they have selected the transportation projects to utilize those funds using their own individual methodologies. The relative amount of the region's funding that is allocated to each is by agreement between them and has traditionally been based on their relative populations. As federal transportation legislation has evolved over time, so has the process for both the allocation of funding and the selection of projects to utilize that funding. In 2008, the councils and city decided to dedicate a portion of the region's funds, 5%, to accomplishing projects that benefited both the city and the suburban region. These funds were taken off the top before the population distribution. Next slide. In recent years, federal transportation legislation that governs the work that we do has become more and more aggressive about requiring that regions move away from arbitrary formulas towards using data about the transportation system's performance and condition. These changes prompted an 18-month-long review of the way STP funding is distributed and projects are selected in the region. The goal was to move away from a formula-based process and toward a process based on data, regional impact, and advancing on to 2050's principles of inclusive growth, resilience, and prioritized investment. To do this meant not just changing how the money was allotted to projects, but also working with our partners to ensure that projects that previously could not have been funded now could be. A big part of that work led to collaboration with IDOT to allow some high-need communities to leverage toll credits in order to pay for projects without having to use any local dollars to match the federal funds. The end result of the review was a new agreement between the councils and the City of Chicago that changed not only how funds are distributed to councils and the city for local programming decisions and how those decisions are made, but also created a new regional program called the STP Shared Fund. Next slide. The STP Shared Fund was created to provide a large enough funding source, approximately $40 million annually, to accomplish projects that can make large and lasting contributions to regional priorities and on to 2050, including reducing congestion, promoting economic growth, and improving safety. A project selection committee with members from the City of Chicago, the suburban mayors, and CMAP, advised by FHWA, IDOT, the RTA, and the counties, was formed to develop a project selection process for the shared fund. This committee also looks at the methodology used during the previous call as a way to evaluate the projects and make suggestions for improvements for the next call for projects. The second program for the shared funds will be presented to the CMAP board and MPO policy committee for approval in October. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to provide an overview of the results from the first program. Next slide. In January of 2019, CMAP issued the first ever call for STP shared fund projects. Up to $200 million in funding was available. This translates to $40 million per year being available for the 5 years from 2020 to 2024. A total of 71 applications were received from 42 unique applicants throughout the region. Those applicants included municipalities, counties, and transit agencies, which had little to no access to STP funds prior to this new program. Overall, $1.3 billion in shared funds were requested to complete projects whose total costs are $2.4 billion. Next slide. After applying the methodology, 17 projects were selected to be funded over the 5-year period. Several of these we feel will be transformational for the region and would not have been funded if not for the reform we all work together to achieve. Some highlights, as listed on the slide here, include renovation of the Homewood Metro Station, CTA Austin Green Line station accessibility improvements, preliminary engineering, 100% federally funded for highway rail grade separations in Burnham and Dolton, and reconstruction of the University Park Metro Station, highway rail grade separation in Barrington, and bridge and highway reconstruction and expansion. Overall, $31 million will go to communities with the highest need. 4 of the 17 projects funded are in communities with populations of less than 10,000, and 25% of the users of these projects will be minorities living below the poverty line. More information on each of the 3 programs just discussed can be found on the CMAP website. And I'm now going to hand it back to Craig to discuss how the travel demand model assists with improving, enhancing, and justifying transportation programming decisions.
All right, thanks, Mary. As she said, we're going to start talking about the travel demand model now. And we'll start out just by giving a little bit of background on it. So these models are really used to help support transportation plans and help us prioritize investment. And they do that because they help us answer questions about the future transportation system performance given changes in the distribution of population or households or just in different transportation investments. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of data inputs needed to support these models. So the first kind that we need is a socioeconomic forecast, which really gives us information about where the future growth in households and jobs are going to be in our region. So for information about household attributes and composition, we largely rely on census data. And for information about retail and total employment, we rely on data from the Illinois Department of Employment Security and also from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And you can see by the graphic on the screen that the area we model is actually quite a bit larger than just the 7 counties that we plan for. And that's really so that we can capture most of the trips that occur within our region on a daily basis. So the models also need information about the transportation supply. So for the transit system, that includes things like transit routes, where stops are located, travel times on the routes, and what the headways are. For roadways, that includes things like anything really that sort of impacts the operation of the roadway. So segment lengths, number of lanes, posted speeds, lane widths, whether or not there's on-street parking. And it's also important for us, especially in places like the Central Business District and for train stations, to understand how much parking is available at these places. We also need information on the costs that travelers incur while they travel. So that includes things like tolls, parking costs, vehicle operating costs, and transit fares. And then lastly, we need behavioral information about how people travel. And so that really comes from conducting a household travel survey. And the last one that we completed was called My Daily Travel. So the survey is really the sort of largest data collection activity that agencies like CMAP undertake. It's really the only way that we can measure and understand changing travel patterns and factors that influence people's travel decisions. It's really the only source of data that has the detailed information needed to really study travel behavior. And doing these surveys also helps us meet a couple of federal regulations. As part of our long-range transportation plan, we have to identify projected demand over the period of the plan. And we also need to certify that the plan is consistent with current and forecasted transportation and land use conditions and trends in our region. So these surveys collect a lot of information. They collect information about households, so where they're located, the number of people in them, what the household income is. They also collect information about all the people in those households, their age, gender, race, and ethnicity, whether they work or go to school. And finally, they collect a lot of information about the travel that the people make, where they're going, what activities they did there, what modes they used to get there, what their arrival and departure times are, and who else made the trip with them. So for our latest survey was completed between August 2018 and April of 2019. Our goal was to get 12,000 completed households, and we actually got about 12,400. And as you can see from the graphic, they were spread fairly well across our geographic area. So now I'll turn it over to Sarah to start talking about the first step in the model.
All right, thanks, Craig. So next slide. One of the data requirements for the model is a list of all households in the region. So this data is not directly available, so we generate it using population synthesis. It's somewhat unique for a trip-based model to use population synthesis, since the level of information generated during the process goes beyond the strict data requirements of the model. But we use this approach to have consistent populations in our trip-based and activity-based models, since the activity-based model does require a greater level of detail. So population synthesis uses marginal distributions or controls as guides in expanding a population sample or the seed data. We utilize American Community Survey Public Use Microdata Sample, or ACS PUMS, household and person files for the seed data, and our controls are informed by other ACS data and our regional forecast. We use the population sim package to carry out the population synthesis process. This is an open source package implemented in Python that uses entropy maximization based list balancing to match the controls at various geographic levels. Each survey record in the seed data is for an individual person tied to a household, and each person in a household are assigned a weight. The population sim package seeks to preserve the distribution of initial weights while matching those marginal controls. Once final weights have been assigned, the seed sample is expanded using the new weights to generate the full synthetic population. Population sim uses linear programming to convert the final weights to integer values and then expands the seed sample using these integer weights. The final outputs in this process are household and person tables enumerating each household and person in the region. The files are run through a post-processing script to properly format them for the trip-based model. And next slide. So the trip-based model has 4 steps and is also called the 4-step model. These steps are trip generation, trip distribution, mode choice, and traffic assignment. I will be covering the trip generation step. In trip generation, we use socioeconomic and land use data to estimate trip ends in the region. Trip ends are classified as productions or attractions. For home-based trips, trip ends located at the traveler's homes are defined as productions, and trip ends located at the non-home end are defined as attractions. The primary output of the trip generation model is a file with vehicular trip ends for all the internal trips of residents in the modeled study area. Note that the trip ends are not connected yet. This happens in the next step, trip distribution. Next slide. So you've seen this map before, but I'll talk about it a little more in the context of trip generation. So these are trip generation zones or subzones, and they are the geography used to aggregate socioeconomic data into geographic units suitable for providing input into the trip generation model to generate those trip productions and attractions. These zones serve as the base level for CMAP's modeling zone systems. Within the CMAP metropolitan planning area, which is the more dense area, the 7-county region, these zones are quarter section size geographies based on the public land survey system. Outside the core area, subzones are based on census geography, and they are larger. Next slide. So the synthetic households that we generated earlier are classified into 624 different categories defined by the composition of the household. The attributes used in the classification are age of householder, number of adults, number of children, number of workers, and income quartile. This table shows the household type definitions. Within each child and income quartile category, in each age of householder category, there are 13 adult worker categories defined by the different combinations of workers and adults. Next slide. So households are also classified into 624 household vehicle types with the same structure as the household type, but considering the number of vehicles owned by the household instead of the income quartile. Household vehicle availability can be taken directly from the synthetic population, or it can be generated by the vehicle ownership submodel. This is a discrete choice Logit model, and models like this are used several times throughout the entire modeling process. And you'll hear more about Logit models in the mode choice section. But to discuss this application, there are 3 or 4 possible vehicle level choices, I, for each household depending on the number of adults. The probability of each vehicle availability level is defined by the first equation here, where UI is the utility of household vehicle availability level I. The utility is a weighted linear combination of household and subzone variables that have been developed in earlier steps in the modeling process. In this case, independent variables, HJ, include attributes such as household workers and income quartile. The bias constant varies based on attributes like the age of householder and the household location, whether it's in the inner Chicago zones, outer Chicago zones, suburbs, etc. The coefficients for this model were estimated with data from the CMAP household travel survey, which Craig mentioned earlier. To make the final vehicle ownership selection, the individual utilities are converted to a cumulative probability distribution, as pictured to the right, and a random number draw is used to identify the point on the distribution for each household and make the vehicle assignment. The household vehicle type can then be defined for each household. Next slide. So at this point in the process, synthetic households have been placed into subzones and assigned a household type and household vehicle type. So the next step is to pair each household with a comparable household from the household travel survey, so that actual trips can be assigned to specific households. This matching process is based on the household vehicle type value, and it seeks to match the synthetic households with a surveyed household from the same area that the initial seed data survey record came from. There are 49 trip purposes used in the model, some of which are shown here. Next slide. So the CMAP survey, the household travel survey, does not gather travel data from group quarters residents. So we mostly use the American Community Survey data to develop trip rates for these populations. Survey data from one-person, low-income, zero-vehicle households is used for the non-work trip rates for these populations, though. The 4 types of group quarters residents that are considered in the model are persons in military barracks, persons in college and university dorms, and people in other group quarters split out by their age. The table here shows the various rates used in modeling group quarters travel by the population type. Next slide. So at this point in trip generation, all trips generated by persons residing inside the modeled study area, both in households and in group quarters, are accounted for. Now, the non-home trip ends must be allocated to subzones. This is done using an attractiveness share, which is defined for each subzone and is a function of employment or households, depending on the trip's purpose in the subzone. Since the Chicago Central Business District is atypical in its mix of employment, subzones within this district are weighted differently from those outside the district. After totaling the shares for all subzones, trip ends are proportionally allocated to subzones by these shares. This table shows the allocation weights for origin non-home trip ends. So for example, when a worker starts a trip at work and ends it at a store to shop, these weights guide where that origin trip should be. Next slide. After accounting for all trips made by the study area residents, the next step is to factor out trip ends for trips with one trip end outside the modeled study area. Only homework trips are factored in this manner due to data limitations, and group quarters trips are excluded from this process. Trips are factored to adjust home productions and workplace attractions in larger geographic areas called PUMAs. This table shows a sample of factors for various PUMAs. Home production factors are the fraction of all trips from internal households linked to external workplaces. Workplace attraction factors is the fraction of all trips to internal workplaces linked to external households. Home productions are factored by workplace attractions, and workplace attractions are factored at the regional level to equal home productions. Next slide. Finally, non-motorized submodels forecast the proportion of trip productions or origins that will be completed by non-motorized modes. These submodels are once again Logit models with coefficients estimated from American Community Survey data. Only person trips using motorized modes are carried through the remainder of the model. Independent variables used in these submodels for each subzone include household and employment variables, the prevalence of zero-vehicle households, the total area to compute the household and employment density, and a measure of pedestrian friendliness. The table here lists the utility coefficients and bias constants used in the models for various person and trip type classes. After the non-motorized shares are calculated, the subzone non-motorized productions are subtracted from total productions. Then motorized attractions are balanced to equal motorized productions. Next slide. So the result of the trip generation process is a table of total motorized productions and attractions by trip type for each subzone. And you can see a sample of that here. This is passed into the next step, trip distribution, which Craig will discuss now.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So in trip distribution, we're going to take the productions and attractions developed, and we're going to connect them into full trips. And we're going to do that using the cost of travel and also observed data on travel patterns. So the first thing we need to do is we need to do some aggregation of the data. Working with the 17,000 plus subzones in trip generation is fine because it's really working with one-dimensional arrays. But for the remainder of the model steps, they're all going to deal with origin destination matrices. So from every origin to every destination. And if we stuck with those 17,000 plus zones, we'd have matrices with more than 300 million cells. So instead what we do is we take the very small subzones within the CMAP planning area and we aggregate those into larger geographies. So what we end up with instead is 3,632 zones, which is equal to about 13 million cells in the origin destination matrix. We're also going to aggregate the trip purposes. So as Sarah mentioned, trip generation deals with 49 specific types of trips. We're going to combine those into 4 broad categories. The first is home-based work. And this means one end of the trip is home and the other end is a work or work-related purpose. It doesn't really matter which end is home and which end is work. They're just called home-based work. And these get separated into 2 different groups, those for high-income workers and those for low-income workers. The next trip category is home-based other trips. So this is any trip that has one end at home and the other end that is not a work-based purpose. So this could be shopping, recreation, socializing, anything that isn't work. And then the final category is non-home-based trips, which is anything that does not have one end that ends at home. So our trip distribution model is a gravity model with intervening opportunities. So if you think about physics, objects with more mass have more gravity. The analogy for trip distribution is locations with more attractions, which could be jobs or households, will draw more trips. And so the premise behind this kind of model is first that travelers try to minimize their time and cost of travel, and also that there's a constant probability that a traveler will find a potential destination acceptable. So for instance, someone going shopping may not stop at the closest store because it may not have what they're looking for. And they will continue passing by other stores until they find one that meets their needs. So to run this model, we need the following inputs. Obviously, productions and attractions from the trip generation model. But we also need to understand each zone's accessibility based on generalized cost. And so we do this by simulating 100 trips between each origin and destination zone. To do this, we use Monte Carlo simulation to vary certain costs, like parking costs, household income, and transit access and egress time. Monte Carlo is a method to reduce the inaccuracy that can result in modeling by relying on just using average values. So instead what we do is we simulate individual values for travelers by selecting at random from a distribution of values for each specific travel cost component. And in the end, what we get is average auto and transit costs between all zones, which are combined into a generalized cost. And then within trip distribution, this is used to rank zones in order of increasing cost from an origin zone. And then the last piece of information we need are an array of L values, which are used to influence trip lengths. And these are really represent how selective an individual traveler is. So a lower value represents a more selective traveler, which generally leads to longer trips. And these are calibrated based on information from our household travel survey. So in an intervening opportunities model, trips between zones are proportional to the productions at the origins and attractions at the destinations. and are inversely proportional to the difficulty of traveling between two zones. And travel impedance is a function not only of generalized cost, but also of the attractions that travelers encounter while journeying between the two zones. So our formulation takes on a negative exponential form. And I'll just sort of briefly go through the different components of it. So alpha I is the production zone I balancing coefficients, and beta J are the attraction zone J balancing coefficients. And I mentioned the L values, which represent traveler selectiveness. And then Vij are the intervening attractions. So these are the attractions that are closer to the production zones than they are to the attraction zones. So the model is actually implemented as an iterative two-dimensional matrix balancing algorithm with the following constraints. Trips distributed from the origin zone have to equal that zone's trip productions. So at the end, when we have a trip table, the sums of the rows will equal the total trip productions for each zone. Similarly, trips distributed to a destination zone have to equal that zone's trip attractions. So in the end, the column sums of a trip table have to equal the total attractions for that zone. Also, the impedances between zones have to be non-negative, and the production and attraction balancing coefficients also have to be non-negative. So at the end of this step, what we achieve is a matrix of daily person trips for each of our 4 trip categories: home-based work for high income, home-based work for low income, home-based other trips, and non-home-based. And now we'll talk about the next step in the model.
All right, thanks, Craig. So Sarah already mentioned Logit models briefly in the household vehicle model, but I have to give a more detailed explanation since the mode choice model relies on them very heavily. So after we distribute the trips and we've determined which ones are motorized, we take those trips and then we answer a simple question. What is the probability that a traveler will take public transit over auto? There are 2 reasons why most travel modelers will use a Logit model instead of a linear one. Linear models allow for results that could be either probability below 0% or above 100%, but that's unrealistic because this is a binary discrete choice situation. You're not going to be 110% sure of making a choice, even though we all say that. And then the second reason, more importantly, is that the curve of a Logit equation captures the reality that a change in conditions isn't going to have the same effect for every traveler. So for example, if you are like a low income worker, maybe living in the suburbs, a decrease in transit fares is going to make your choice to take transit like much more appealing than it was before. But if you're maybe like a high income worker living in the city and you've already pretty much made up your mind that you take the L to work, a change in fare isn't really going to change your behavior much. Next slide, please. So this is our mode choice Logit equation. You don't have to focus on every single detail, but the most important part is this utility equation shown both at the numerator and the denominator. And this is where we plug in all of our inputs. Next slide. The vectors included, the vectors of variables in this calculation are level of service provided by a mode. So this can be things like fare, parking costs, headway between trains and buses, and so on. Then socioeconomic characteristics, which is primarily income. And then trip characteristics, so things such as if the destination is in the CBD or if it's a work trip or non-work trip. Next slide. There are vectors of coefficients as well that are applied to all the variables. CMAP has already determined these, and they differ depending on whether the trip is between high income, low income, work, non-work, CBD or not. And so they are applied to socioeconomic, level of service, and trip characteristics, There's also this fourth coefficient, A, which is specific to the mode, transit or auto, and that is constant across all travelers and their destinations, and this can be things such as safety, comfort of the mode, and just general bias for or against. Next slide, please. These predetermined coefficients are, so this makes more sense if I show it in an example. So you can see here there's two trips with the exact same characteristics, traveler type, costs, and trip purpose, but the big difference here is that the top one is to the central area and then the other one ends outside of it. So these trips will get a different set of coefficients, which are shown in the teal box here. The variables coefficients are multiplied together for both modes, and then they take the difference, and everything's plugged into this utility equation that I pointed out earlier, resulting in the orange boxes. Then we continue to plug and chug these values into the Logit equation, and ultimately we end up with a 25% chance that the top worker will pick transit, and then a 10% chance that the bottom worker will pick it. Next slide, please. So now you've noticed that there are a lot of costs that we've mentioned. We include the following variables: fare parking at the applicable boarding station, travel times, wait times, in-vehicle time, highway distance, vehicle operating costs, and the destination parking costs of the destination if the mode ends up being auto. So to convert all of the time-related costs into monetary values, we have predetermined the value of time factors. These will vary depending on the trip, which makes sense intuitively. So for example, if you have a work trip, it's more likely going to be more important than a non-work trip. So you're going to feel a greater sense of urgency, and every minute that you are sitting in traffic is valued much more. These travel conditions are also influenced by the time of day, because that will greatly affect your waiting times and your cost. So to reflect that, we estimate all of the work trips under the peak morning conditions, and then non-work trips are under midday conditions. Next slide, please. Tolls are also a mode-specific cost, so of course they will influence this decision, but they get slightly special treatment. So tolling costs aren't actually calculated until step 4, traffic assignment, when we determine the most optimal path, and that will reveal if it involves the tollway. Jose will explain this a little bit more, but the entire model goes through 4 global iterations, just in order to average out trends and find equilibrium between all of the paths. So after auto paths are chosen and we know if it involves the toll or not, then we take it into account on the second time around. Next slide, please. Another crucial part to this submodel is Monte Carlo simulations. Using this method avoids inaccuracy of just simply plugging in average values, and it allows us to convert these population averages into individualized data points. So we use this technique to estimate access and egress characteristics to the transit network, travelers' income, parking costs, and the walk between parking and your destination. And ultimately, we also will use this to make that final decision of transit or not. So a value is picked randomly from a distribution and then plugged into our equations. Next slide. What makes the results even more realistic is that the distributions of all these variables will differ depending on location. So income distribution will vary depending on the home location of the traveler. Access egress details will change based on which zone the station is located in, and then Parking costs, distribution of that will vary for each zone in the CBD. So Monte Carlo simulations are only effective when repeated. We apply this technique 100 times for every origin destination zone pair. And so that's going to minimize the variance and converge our sample of values towards the true mean, which according to the law of large numbers happens. Next slide. After we sort the trips into transit or auto, there's one more step. The auto trips are passed through another submodel to determine how many people are going to ride in that car. It can be single occupancy or high occupancy, either 2 or 3+ riders. So to answer this, we split the auto trips into work and non-work purposes, and then we reference results from the household vehicle ownership submodel that Sarah talked about earlier. For non-work trips, we use the Census Transportation Planning Products worker flow tables to create a bias constant towards these 3 occupancy levels, and then we assign the trips accordingly. For non-work trips, we connect them to the previously enumerated household file, which contains info on trip purpose and car occupancy from the My Daily Travel survey. Then we assign vehicle occupancy according to the behavior we see in those surveys. And now that we have our auto and transit trips, we pass it into the traffic assignment model.
Thank you, Greta. Next, the final step of the modeling process is traffic assignment. And here is a summary of traffic assignment. Traffic assignment develops congested travel times, which are then fed back into the trip distribution mode choice assignment cycle. This occurs 5 times. And then the final link volumes from the assignment are developed using the method of successive averages, or MSA, over all of those respective iterations. The prerequisite data before we move with traffic assignment is the daily demand matrices from the mode choice process, of which Greta explained earlier in terms of auto subtrips. Also, we need distinct time of day periods, or what will be referred to as TOD. Along with those TOD are distinctive highway networks that incorporate expressway and arterial directional travel and parking restrictions, such as no parking in rush hour or reversible lanes on expressways that only operate certain hours of the day. There is also auto classification, which we've discussed earlier, single occupant vehicle, high occupant vehicle, and high occupant vehicle with 3+ persons, and also truck classifications, which we have 4 classes: B plates, pickups basically, light trucks, medium trucks also known as SU, and heavy truck also known as MU. Next slide, please. The assignment process is a path-based traffic assignment. It works on an origin-destination pair basis, and it iteratively solves the problem. It assigns vehicle trips to the roadway network and calculates zone-to-zone travel costs. It seeks equality in costs among the alternative paths between the same origin and destination pair. A new path that is significantly shorter than the current one is added to the set. All paths that carry flow are adjusted simultaneously. Flow shifted from paths with higher than average path cost to those with lower than average path cost. The amount of flow changes to shift are calculated with each iteration. Next slide. In terms of behavior, each traveler chooses the best path. If a better one is available, they will take it. Best is in terms of minimizing generalized costs, and this includes travel time and tolls. This is what's known as Wardrop's user optimal principle. It also means an individual's route choice impacts other travelers. Also, volume delay functions calculate congested link travel time, and this process directs network routing, e.g. travel times increase as traffic increases. And then the traffic assignment stops when the current solution is sufficiently close to a perfect equilibrium solution based on identified thresholds and determined by calculating the shortest path between each origin and destination for each user class. Next slide. And here's just a simplified flowchart of the process itself, beginning with the assignment of time periods and the daily trip tables that came from the previous steps, and then going through the iteration process and resulting in the MSA link volumes. Next slide. The time, further discussion about auto person trip TOD factors, the time of day periods that we use for them were determined based on trip in motion driver data from our predecessor agency CAT's 1990 household survey. And this was also confirmed, these were also confirmed by CMAP's travel tracker data process in 2007. The trips are distributed in the TODs as what are known as vehicle equivalents within the CMAP network for the particular model year we are interested in forecasting. The directional factors, the specific OD pairs, are converted to proportions of productions and attractions. And within the TOD factor and broke matrix with origin destination type, that is where we assign the different auto modes and also the truck classes. In addition, we also explore external trips within the region, whether they're made by auto, truck, or visiting air passengers. Next slide. The global iteration process is actually 5 steps, but are numbered 0 through 4. The first iteration, iteration 0, is corresponds to the by time of day to the 4 network scenarios that are selected. Matrices are used to store the period trip tables. Those are initialized or cleared. Then the matrices are filled with the factor trip tables from the daily trip tables. The volume delay functions are loaded. Full equilibrium assignment is completed, and the process repeats through the remaining 7 time of day periods. For the next iterations, link volumes and travel times are averaged with the same time periods from previous global iterations. And it is at this time, as Greta said, that total cost is factored into the assignment process. The final product, step 2 here, is 8 modeled scenarios representing time of day containing final MSA volumes and also speeds for emissions calculations are thereby generated. Next slide. And here's a brief explanation of volume delay functions and their use. And this will be in terms of arterials on this slide. The VDFs represent congestion that occurs on links as traffic volumes increase. There is both intersection delay and also incremental signal delay that are combined with the link travel times that are estimated. And these are expressed through the variables VDF1 for arterial roads and VDF3, which are basically freeway exit ramp to arterial roads. And how they're factored in is they're basically applied to the primary link travel time between intersections, which is the basic BPR function, where the time is a dependent function of the volume capacity ratio and also the absolute uncongested travel time in a given link. As far as uniform intersection delay, we add to that link travel time a delay factor that is an expression of not only the volume capacity ratio, but also coefficients related to the green time that is encountered by a intersection approach and the percentage of that green time within the entire cycle, the signal cycle. And obviously for more prominent arterials or larger capacity, larger volume arterials, those will typically be a larger share or a larger percentage. So the delay would probably be less. And then there is also an additional incremental delay factor that is applied that is a function of the green cycle. Next slide. And here's an example of a volume delay functions between the difference between a minor arterial link and a major arterial link, and that congested conditions, a higher VC ratio will be encountered more readily by the minor arterial link, and thus will have a greater effect on travel time in and of itself than what we would see with a major arterial link that has a largely favorable green cycle at its terminus. Next slide. For limited access facilities, such as freeways, expressways, and ramps, as well as metered ramps, they have distinct volume delay functions as well, represented by VDF2, VDF4, VDF5, and VDF7 within the CMAP model. These volume delay functions have been revised from the standard volume delay functions that you saw for the arterials. And this is to reduce the overassignment of volume and congested peak periods due to the effects of path building under uncongested travel times. Also to correct the inability to model bottlenecks, and also to not restrict freeway on-ramps whose peak period capacities are controlled by metering. Tolled facilities are similar to the above, limited access VDFs. However, we only model tolled links basically as gantries on the entry ramps and some short midstream links that are actually less than 200 feet in most places. So they have their own volume delay function value. Next slide. Here's an example of the expressway volume delay function with the revisions that account for, to try to correct for speed, to increase speed and capacity in the uncongested condition, but also to acknowledge the fact that, to acknowledge bottleneck conditions once the VC ratio increases. And as you can see, this is the difference that one encounters. The original BPR function did not did not result in increased travel time to the magnitude that was observed in real-time data. So that was the purpose, and that's how we corrected the volume delay, the BPR function for that. Next slide. Also, in addition, now to cover link speeds, in addition to traffic volumes for each link for each time period per day, the speed of travel is calculated by an equation that uses the volume capacity ratio for the link as the independent variable. And the following equations are then used to determine the final link speed, which is also used in the final emissions calculations. Again, where speed is a dependent variable mainly of the volume capacity ratio. And with that, I will turn it over to Craig once again to summarize the steps of the model.
All right, thanks, Jose. So that was a brief summary of the main steps in the model. I just wanted to sort of close out this section by just kind of identifying, what the model does well and what the model doesn't do well. So first off, the model does allow travelers to change their trip destinations. It allows them to switch between driving or transit. It allows them to choose a new driving route based on the congested conditions they experience, or to develop a new transit strategy based on transit service changes. And it allows them to respond to either large scale or small scale, such as project level changes. The model does not allow households to change their location or employers to change their location. These things can be done by changing the input data of the model, but they can't be changed once they're within the modeling process. The model also doesn't allow residents of households to decide to travel less frequently. So once trips have been generated through the trip generation process, they have to be completed. And the model also does not allow travelers to choose to travel at a different time of day. So the CMAP trip-based model is not well suited to really measuring intersection level performance, things like queuing, intersection delay, or turn delay. It also doesn't do a good job of measuring the impacts of random events or opening day forecasts or unpredictable events like crashes. And that's because the model assumes that travelers have perfect information about travel. And so they don't see those events as being unexpected. The model also does not do a good job of producing estimates of boardings at specific transit stations, or for producing boardings for individual bus routes. Those are really both below the level of fidelity for a regional travel demand model. What the model does do well, though, is show the demand of travel based on the region's households and the characteristics of those households. It does identify changing travel patterns due to different development patterns, or due to changes in the accessibility of the transportation network. It also reflects mode changes due to highway or transit network changes, and it shows the change in traffic volumes in response to either congestion or changes in the roadway capacity. So for the next section now, we're going to talk about how we validate our model.
Okay, thank you. With regard to validation, model validation involves comparing model inputs and outputs to equivalent observed data in order to answer the question, well, how well is the model able to represent real-world conditions? But you must understand that the goal is not perfect simulation of real-world conditions. Some of it was just discussed. However, each 4 of the trip-based model steps were subject to specific data set comparisons in the validation process. So I'll explain beginning now. Next slide. With regard to trip generation, the validation tests focused on households, trip generation rates, and employment. Household work trip generation was judged similar to peer MPO regions, and also workplace trips were determined to be reasonable approximations of activity per the Federal Highway Administration. And the chart to the right explains compares the employment depicted by the model versus that depicted by observed data from LEHD data from on the map in the year 2014. Next slide. For trip distribution, the validation tests focused on trip distance, work trip flows, and duration. Modeled average work trip distance and average work trip distance to the central business district were judged to be within 5% of observed values at the regional level. And to the right, you will see visualizations of the modeled and observed work trip flows using PUMA data comparisons, along with very strong correlation coefficients, further indicating that the flows are very similar. So basically, you don't see a lot of areas that are deep shade colors of either blue or red. So the lighter shades tend to be within 5% of the difference between the modeled and the observed data. Next slide. With regard to mode choice, the validation tests compared transit mode share and home-based work trip modes. Overall transit share for the region showed a difference of 1 percentage point between modeled and observed data. The model was judged to match observed SO single occupant vehicle trips, while overestimating high occupancy vehicle trips and underestimating transit trips. And here is just a visual representation of the findings with regard to those, to that validation. Next slide. For trip assignment, the traffic assignment validation addresses 2 types of assignment: assignment on the highway network and assignment on the transit network. The tests of the highway assignment examine vehicle miles traveled, VMT, and link volumes. Transit assignment tests look at boardings as well as origins and destinations. Also, speed and travel time were evaluated on the highway network. Next. For highway assignment, total modeled VMT were judged to be within 0.1% of the observed value. More fluctuation was observed when looking at the individual facility. With regard to modeled link volumes, they showed very strong relationships with the observed traffic counts as judged by the graphic on the right. And they results match standards used by the Florida Department of Transportation. Next slide. Here's another comparison that's broken out by time of day with regard to a specific volume class, with regard to observed and modeled data. And again, those are judged to be roughly similar in all time periods and in the volume classes. Next slide. For transit assignment, total modeled and observed transit boardings showed a difference of less than 3%, with the model making small overestimations of Metra and bus boardings. Transit boardings by trip purpose are also close, with a small underestimation of CTA commuters and a small overestimation of Metra or heavy rail commuters. Next slide. In terms of travel speed, our tests for that as well as travel distance were used for using data from the National Performance Management Research data sets. And these are just a compilation of various vehicle probe data using various methods such as navigation devices, cell phones, and vehicle transponders. And we also had truck probe data provided by the American Transportation Research Institute. As far as comparing their observations with our model, the MPM RDS provided what are called traffic message channel code segments. And these are unique geographies that are used as a means to communicate traffic and travel data to and from motorists, and they are generally integrated in vehicle navigation systems. So just these are some comparisons we saw between the first TOD periods of the day or actually TOD 1, 2, and 5 for various speed measures by road classification, and the difference between the TMC speed and the model link speed. Next slide. In terms of travel time, the travel time showed a strong correlation between the TMC segments and the model links, as you will see for AM peak, midday, and TMC time periods. However, the model was judged to lengthen the AM peak and midday travel times and underestimate overnight travel times. Next slide. So in conclusion, with regard to validation, the CMAP trip-based travel demand model validation report released in 2017 has shown that its trip-based demand model yields reasonable results when compared to this observed data. At that time, there were 4 focus areas recommended for improvement. And that was, the first was county level workflows. And this was just addressed mainly between Cook County and DuPage County, that they could be improved to be a closer match with the observed data. And also a second area was the origins of transit work trips to the central business district. There are various areas with over and underestimation of these trips in certain areas of the region, which you may have seen in the mode share graphic of the 7-county region. Also, another area of improvement was HOV mode share. And there was, the analysis showed that there's room for improvement in the share of home-based work trips that the model estimates are being made as HOV trips. And also, finally, in the fourth focus area of improvement, roadway congestion. The travel time contour analysis showed that the model is overestimating the amount of roadway congestion in the south and west parts of Cook County. And that concludes the section on model validation. And I'll turn it over for model applications, the first one being regional conformity analysis.
Thanks, Jose. So now that we've stepped through a bit of how the model works and how we validated it, we'll show some examples of how we use it. So one important application of the model is our regional conformity analysis process, which Craig mentioned in the intro to this presentation. Transportation conformity is required under the Clean Air Act to ensure that federally supported transportation activities are consistent with or conform to the purpose of a state's Air Quality Implementation Plan, or SIP, for areas that are in non-attainment or maintenance of national ambient air quality standards. The CMAP region is currently in non-attainment for ozone. CMAP makes a conformity determination twice per year for all projects with the potential to affect the region's air quality in the Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP. A determination must also be made for long-range transportation plans and any other transportation projects funded or approved by the Federal Highway or Transit Administration. Next slide. So the analysis must demonstrate that total emissions from on-road travel on an area's transportation system are consistent with goals for air quality found in the SIP. So this is a screenshot from a recent conformity memo that demonstrates that the production of ozone precursors, which are volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides, the production is below the SIP budgets for each analysis year. Next slide. And this is determined by using the Motor Vehicle Emission Simulator, or MOVES, to produce those emissions estimates. And our trip-based model provides the inputs needed for the MOVES model run. So projects to be analyzed are added into the highway networks used in the travel model, and then we do a full travel model run. The highway assignment step produces link loads and link speeds, which are converted into the proper format for the MOVES run. The assignment model defines vehicles in terms of how much of a roadway's available capacity to carry traffic is used for a given loading. But the MOVES model defines vehicles in terms of engine type and size, since that's what's relevant for emissions calculations. So a conversion must be made there. MOVES inputs from the travel model include the average speed distribution, road type distribution, ramp fraction, hourly VMT fraction, and daily VMT by vehicle class. In addition, MOVES uses files that originate outside the travel model, such as meteorology and fuel composition data. The MOVES run produces daily emissions inventories by month and day type for selected pollutants. It provides the values used to compare to the SIP budget, as you saw on the previous slide. And now we'll move on to a second application of RSPs.
All right, so another important application of our model is the evaluation of regionally significant projects, or RSPs. Our On to 2050 plan is a fiscally constrained plan, so we must make recommendations that are within a reasonable future funding predictions. It's between maintaining a state of good repair and then making crucially needed expansions and enhancements to our system. CMAP estimates that we'll face about a $24 billion gap in funding. We have a list of over 100 RSPs that total over $219 billion. So we obviously can't add all of these projects to the plan. Therefore, we created a process that evaluates all of these projects with our region's needs and our On to 2050 goals in mind. We conduct these evaluations before every new plan release and then before every plan update. And since there will be a 2050 update coming soon, we'll be working on this process in the next few months. After reviewing our last plan, Go to 2040, the US DOT recommended that a selection of major capital projects should be based on their impact, not their scope. So for example, a bus rapid transit system is going to be significantly less costly than a major rail improvement, but its benefits can bring, it can bring just as many benefits to the community. Therefore, it's going to be very cost effective. This guidance has helped us create a new definition of RSPs and helps us prioritize projects for the current plan. So now our current definition, an RSP must cost at least $100 million and either changes capacity on the national highway system, either a new expressway, arterial, or added lanes, or it changes capacity on transit services with a separate right-of-way or a shared right-of-way where it's given, transit is given priority over auto, or the RSP just has to cost over $250 million. to be included in our evaluation. Next slide, please. We measure the impact of every project within 3 general categories. So the first is scoring all of them based on how well they'll address today's needs. These needs will be different depending on whether the project is transit or highway based. If the evaluation shows that a project will improve an area with the project area with all of these conditions being very poor, it'll be scored with a high priority. So these will be such as poor asset condition, capacity, restraint, reliability, or in need of ADA improvement for transit. And then it'll score highly if it will be improving, the structural integrity of bridges, pavement condition, crash safety, congestion levels, and reliability. Next slide. The second general category is scoring a project on how well they are expected to perform in 2050. So a project with really long-lasting, long-term effects will be ranked with high priority. These will be things such as, I won't read everyone, but improving travel time for work trips in both the project area and then its contribution to the whole region, improving its access, how well it improves access to jobs, if there are fewer fatalities and injuries projected, if it decreases congestion VHT, which stands for vehicle hours traveled, things such as that. Next slide, please. So the final category scores on how well a project will address our long-range plan's priorities for climate resilience and inclusive growth. So many of these metrics will involve the concept of EDAs, so I'll explain those first. An EDA is an economically disconnected area. So these are census tracts that have a high concentration of low-income households, plus higher than average proportions of residents that are either minorities or people with limited English proficiency. Historically, it's been shown that communities with these characteristics will face high unemployment rates, lower educational attainment, and longer than average commute times, amongst other challenges in quality of life. There are also economically disinvested areas. These are spots showing consistent decline in economic activity, very little small business investment, and lowering commercial property values. So overall, these kinds of areas need extra attention if we are to move forward as an entire region. Next slide, please. So these are the metrics that will advance our Onto 2050 plan. Again, they're different between transit and highway-oriented projects. Many of these involve climate or EDA, improvement to EDA residents. Next slide. So if you would like more details on all of the evaluation metrics, even see a complete list of the RSPs and how they scored, you can find this info on the appendix page of our Onto 2050 website and download the RSP benefits report. And I'll pass it on.
Now, another model application is small area traffic forecasts. Definition of a small area traffic forecast is that they are future traffic volume data based on CMAP's most recent regional travel demand analysis as provided by its trip-based model. Currently, CMAP travel models use the adopted regional 2050 socioeconomic projections, and they assume the implementation of the Onto 2050 comprehensive regional plan for Northeastern Illinois. And the traffic projections, as they're depicted, consider projects as they appear in the current Transportation Improvement Program, or the TIP, the ETIP, and regional transportation plan, and that is provided for 2050. Next slide. SATF results are provided to requesters, consultants, engineers, and governmental units for inclusion in and satisfaction of requirements for engineering studies such as phase 1 and phase 2, design studies or reports, which can be preliminary or final, also environmental impact statements, and also large planning documents such as comprehensive plans for municipalities or long-range transportation plans that are produced by county DOTs. They may also be requested and utilized for multi-stakeholder infrastructure plans, such as the Create Rail plan in the Chicago region. Also for parking and traffic studies, for parcel development, and also for parcel development, just the act of the road permit access that is sought from IDOT or a county DOT. And also recently we've been getting requests from developers of multi-unit residential housing for to satisfy HUD noise assessment studies. Next slide. The SATF forecast results are then used by requesters and government sponsors for competitive grant programs, such as the aforementioned Congestion Mitigation Air Quality, or CMAQ, the Surface Transportation Program, STP program, as administered by county DOTs and county council of governments. And also another one is the IDOT Highway Safety Improvement Program. Through the above programs or through standard regional programming, projects are placed in the CMAP region's multi-year TIP. However, future year volumes may still be needed for subsequent reports and studies. So they may make a request 1-2 years into the future as a project that may have once been kind of a pie in the sky proposal. It moves forward through our programming. So next slide. Here are some of the more basics on future year forecasts. CMAP provides roughly 300 SATFs per calendar year, and also within the same time frame provides results for 20 multi-scenario forecasts, which may have 2 alternatives, but also could also include 15 alternatives or more. The traffic forecasts are provided for the year 2050. The recipient may interpolate an interim value if the project horizon sought is less than 30 years. And the result is provided back as ADT, or average daily traffic. CMAP can change that and provide annual average daily traffic or vehicle per days if it is requested. Next slide. The ONTO 2050 model inputs for future volume calculation are going to be the volume data from the 2020 base model network, and then subsequently the 2050 fiscally constrained model network from the ONTO 2050 plan. Once those are obtained, the link shape files are then exported from our modeling system. Then they are exported as GIS coverage to our ARC software packages. Next slide. And from those model link volumes, we develop a two growth factors in terms of calculation. We determine a 2050 from 2020 growth factor, which is there in the middle, and also something known as a net sum, which is just a net whole number differential, not based on division. Then the growth factor and the net sum become the primary basis for determining the future increase in volume. In most cases, an average value is calculated and will represent the 2050 ADT that is returned to the requester, though any value within the range of the growth factor and the net sum may also be acceptable. Next slide. A third way of determining future growth is the socioeconomic factor, which is derived from forecasted growth in households and employment within one or a combination of CMAP's traffic analysis zones, there are 36, just over 36 or 3,600 of them in the CMAP model network area. You may have seen the geography early in the presentation. Socioeconomic calculation may be used for segments not represented by network links in both the 2020 and 2050 model networks. And for segments with no network link, but near segments with links, a factor reflecting the forecast for the link segments may be used for these adjacent non-linked segments, and a small adjustment may be made based on intersection balancing. Next slide. And we'll now go on to how these SATFs can be applied in the context of project studies. And again, some of them, here are some of the categories of them. Again, phase 1 engineering, also project design reports, PEL studies, which are kind of a comprehensive format combining planning and environmental linkages, and environmental impact statements, and large parcel developments, traffic impact studies. Next slide. Most of these project studies and reports are usually just alternative analyses. They'll usually have one or two alternatives based on the project and its requester. So you can see this is part of an ongoing study for I-80 in the western part of Will County. So basically they wanted to model some alternatives that featured some ramp changes here. Like now it's not just a clover leaf, but there's a sweep ramp here at 55 and 80. And also just an add lane section that probably goes through the whole project corridor. So we added the lane here. And also in the year 2050, there will be a Howbolt bridge installed, and also a coordinated improvement, not just an interchange improvement at Illinois 59, but also access to a multi-use development known as the Joliet Gateway that has residential, commercial, and some industrial as part of it. So next slide. One project we've been working on a CMAP for several years, starting in 2013, was the North Lakeshore Drive Level 3 travel demand and environmental analysis. And basically it just addresses the effects of implementing alternative deployments, and also the no action scenario for a section of North Lakeshore Drive expanding from Grand Avenue all the way to its northern terminus at Hollywood Avenue, roughly a 7-mile corridor. It's a multimodal and improvement project, not only encompassing passenger vehicle, but not truck. It's not allowed there. It also addresses transit improvements and bicycle and pedestrian upgrades. IDOT and CDOT are the project sponsors, with Civil Tech being the lead consultant. And again, we've been working with those since 2013 to produce year 2040 forecasts, and since last fall to update to year 2050 data. Next slide. Again, 11 alternate scenarios plus a no action scenario were explored. We explored contextual geometric improvements, which are noted by the CTT scenarios in the graphic to your right, and also forms of dedicated transit lanes, bus-only lanes, and what are called managed lanes, which would be priced lanes in the existing travel lanes that are most closest to the median. And then also tolling of both the managed lanes and also possibly the general purpose lanes at the stated prices per mile. Next slide. And here are just some of the performance measures, as well as just general volume, 24-hour volume data that was requested for the project. And if you saw maybe 2 slides earlier, there was 2 distinct geographies. There's a corridor study area and a lakefront study area. And these are just, we determined performance measures, we calculated performance measures for both. But here are just some examples that kind of touch on things that are covered through modeling itself, such as transit share, parsed out by trip purpose. You also have arterial speed, also VMT and vehicle hours traveled, which are measures of congestion. Next slide. And here are some preliminary 24-hour volumes that were determined for the non-tolled scenarios, where the general purpose lanes were not tolled. In terms of balancing, we balanced them from the northern terminus downward using the southbound ramps as a primary indicator of input and output for volume. So there are significant changes between the scenarios. Mainly in terms, you see the greatest change probably in the transit supportive scenarios, DTWL1 and BOL 3.1. Due to favorable treatment of transit vehicles and also improved service, there is a greater mode change that was depicted by the modeled results. Next slide. And here are just some of those other indicators, such as home to work trips, non-home base, home to other, and also the transit share of shared trips. Not a great deal of difference, but there is upward movement in terms of transit share once you deploy the more robust North Lakeshore Drive alternatives. And also trip distance and trip travel time are also measured in this chart. Next. And here is an analysis of our tolled alternatives for greenhouse gas output. And again, it's what we sort of expected. Once you incentivize the alternate modes, such as transit, you see a much reduction in terms of grams of greenhouse gas being produced within the lakefront corridor of the North Lakeshore Drive. So with that, I'd like to go to model improvements.
Yeah, as the final section of our presentation, I'll just spend a minute kind of talking about modeling improvements. Since we did recently just complete the household travel survey, as we've mentioned, that's generally a time when agencies will work on updating their models to get the new travel behavior reflected. And so over the last year and a half, we have been working on making a set of improvements, and work on that should be completed by the spring of next year. So specifically what we've done is we've made some changes to the trip generation model so that they will explicitly address people working remotely. That's obviously been a key issue over the last year and a half. We've calibrated the submodels throughout the whole model system to reflect the new travel survey data and those travel patterns. One of the biggest changes we've made is we have done sort of a wholesale replacement of the trip distribution model and mode choice model, and we've instead replaced them with an integrated model that will solve trip location and mode choice simultaneously. So this really gives us a significant theoretical improvement over trying to handle those two things as two sequential steps. We've also expanded our mode choice options to include beyond just auto and transit, to include walking, biking, but also hired cars, which include taxis and transportation network companies. We've also implemented a time of day choice model, so travelers will be able to choose to take their trip at a different time of day if they see significant congestion as an impediment to making it when they originally want to. And finally, we've also included visitor trip demand within mode choice, so it will also split out visitor trips between the various options that are available. If anyone's interested in finding out more information about CMAP's modeling or how we program our transportation funds, you can find more information on our website. And on behalf of the entire presentation team, I'd like to thank you for your time today.
Great, thanks guys.